Okie dokie, we are ready for India ink. I had a student ask me earlier, why is it called India ink? So I had to do a little research, but I did think it was interesting. Black ink, this is according to windsornewton.com, black ink was known as Masi in India, a mixture of different ashes, water, and animal glue. It was only in the mid 17th century when Europe began importing ink from India that it became known as India ink. So we have the ink already poured out into some smaller bottles for you with droppers. And we also have some water because you're going to need to dilute the India ink to create a bunch of different values of the ink. So to get like these lighter washes, you'll use a lot more water. And to get some of these darker values, you'll use less water, more ink. It's very much like watercolor. You do need to understand, though, that India ink is permanent. So please, please, please be very, very cautious. Also, make sure you're being very careful with these bottles. If you get anything on the outside, be a good citizen. Go get some wet paper towels and wipe off the bottle. So that way, whoever sits at your table next doesn't have to deal with getting their hands all over a messy bottle. Okay, so I had to make a little makeshift palette here because I realized I forgot to bring a palette home for my demonstration. You can use your clay palette that you made if you want to use that for this project. You basically need little sections that you can mix up different values of ink, lights and darks. You can also use the plastic palettes that we have provided for you in at your table in your little kits. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is my water. And I'm going to put varying amounts. Put a couple droppers full. This is going to be a really light wash here. And then maybe just 2 here. I'm just going to start with 3 different values for now. And I'm going to have just some straight up black India ink right here. I'm just, if you're not sure how to use these droppers, I think you use them in science class quite a bit. But you want to make sure that you're squeezing when it's in the bottle and then releasing so that way it sort of fills up the dropper. Yeah, that should be plenty of ink for me to start with that's not diluted with water. I'm going to put 1 careful drop in here. Put 1 in each since I actually started with like less water. I'm going to test it out, and then if I need to add more water to get some different values, I'll do that. All right, so I'm mixing up the ink and the water. And I'm just going to brush it onto my scrap piece of paper so I can see how dark or light it is. It's almost like a nice mid-gray. So now I'm going to do this actually in a different section of my palette. Put some clean water. That way if I need to carry some over to another area, I can. I'm going to go ahead and drop some more water in here so I can make up a lighter value. It's very much a guess and check sort of process. I'm going to actually take my dirty brush and just put it into this little area here. And brush it on. So that barely has any ink, but that really, really light area is a nice light value to work with. All right, now let me see what I've got over here. That one got a little bit darker, which makes sense because I started with less water and added the same amount of ink. And this one, it's not a very big difference. So what I can do is I can take my brush and lift a little bit out of one area and add it to another. What I'm just hoping to get is some different values to work with. This is nice. This is a little bit darker now. You can also see what it looks like painting straight out of the ink that's not diluted. Ooh, you'll notice it's nice and dark. Very nice. Okay, so I have some ranges of value. I might have to kind of play back and forth, add some water, clean off my brush, use some more undiluted ink, and just go back and forth. It's a pretty like intuitive process, but I have some good values to kind of start with. I want to make a mental note about which one looks like which. I do also have a water cup handy, if just in case I need to clean my brush off. Okay, it's really important at this stage that you have taken a picture of your artwork with your Sharpie on it before you start inking. The thing about the ink is that it's permanent. It's permanent on your clothes, and it's very permanent on your artwork. So it's really important to start with some of your lighter values first. So I'm going to keep this little piece of scrap paper handy. That way, before I add anything to my artwork, I can see how it looks off to the side here. I want to start with the lighter values and then go darker. However, there are some areas where I know I want it to be very, very, very dark. For instance, the very background here. That I don't really have to worry about diluting as much. But when I start shading in, especially like people and characters, I want to start with some of my lighter values of ink. So I have this really, really light wash over here. I'm going to go ahead and start putting that in my spider. And as I'm applying it, I realize it's really, really light. I think I'm going to do every other stripe this color. And then maybe I'll add some darker stripes in between. I'm really struggling with talking today. My goodness. All right. So now I want to transition to do the darker stripes. So I'm going to use a darker ink. Test it out here, make sure which one it is. I think I actually even went darker than that. The ink by itself is a little too dark, so maybe on my palette I'm going to start another little area. Drop a little water in. All right, that's nice. It's a nice sort of a darker mid-gray. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and paint that. Notice how I'm just using the tip of my paintbrush. The really nice thing is, because we're using Tim Burton as some inspiration, it's okay if we get a little color outside the lines. If you look at Tim Burton's work, he often has swatches of color and gray that sort of spill outside the lines, and that's totally okay. Just gives it a little wonky character. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go fill in some more, going back and forth, making sure not to use too dark of India ink as I go along, but I'm going to start with some of my lighter values all over. And then if I need to make it darker, I'll use some of these darker values, being sure to test it out on my paper before I apply. Okay, I do want to show you that while the ink is permanent, when it is wet, you do have a little bit of wiggle room. So I know I just got a little bit of too much ink here that I really wanted to put down, so I'm going to keep it wet. And if I take carefully like the corner of a paper towel and just, I'm not really even blotting, I'm just sort of letting the paper towel absorb the extra ink, and it just sort of like picks up all of that extra ink that I didn't like. So same thing here, got a little too dark, put down a little water. I'm going to take my paper towel, just let it zoop. All right, saved by water. So you do have some workable time while it is wet, and you can reactivate it, absorb it away. The important thing is that you're not just pressing down and dabbing really hard, but just letting the paper towel absorb the water away from your work. Same thing if you ever get like too puddly of ink or any sort of wash on here, you can do the exact same thing. You can just sort of like let the paper towel carefully absorb anything that's too liquidy. All right, now my product is done. I am pleased with this. A couple of closing thoughts for you. First of all, I'd never refilled my palette during the entire time that I was painting the ink on, and look at how much ink I still have left over. So when you are getting drops of water and ink out of here, please know that you really do not have to use that much. A little goes a long way. When you are all done, you want to be very careful about cleaning out your palettes. I highly recommend taking a paper towel and putting it on top of your ink as you take this over to the trash can, so that way it doesn't spill while you are going to the trash can, and then you can throw the ink away. It should pretty much largely absorb into the paper towel. If you need to clean off a little more, feel free to rinse it under the sink to make sure you don't leave any ink behind. Other stuff I've thought about. Contrast. Contrast is really important. Contrast is the difference between light and dark. And when you have high contrast, you have bright brights next to dark darks. When you have low contrast, you have a lot of medium gray next to each other. And so it kind of flattens it out. High contrast makes it a lot easier to see your pictures. So in order for this dark monster to stand out, I had to make sure that this wall here was white. And same thing here. In order to be able to see some of the lighter features on the people and the spider, I had to make sure that there was a dark background behind it. Okay, so if you want to be able to see these dark shapes, you want to make sure that the value you put around it is not very dark. So you can either leave it primarily white or really make sure that you have a diluted mix of ink to go around it so you can still really see it. Same thing if you have a really light shape. A light shape on a light background is probably going to get kind of lost. So if you really, really, really want to be able to see it, use some more undiluted ink to go around it for your background. Last thing I want to talk about is that the ink very much behaves like watercolor. So if you think about some of the watercolor techniques that Miss Braun taught you, they do a lot of the same thing here. For instance, if you have a wet background and you dip some wet ink into it, it behaves very much like that wet on wet watercolor technique that you learned. So if you're looking for something like an eerie sky or something, like wet and wet works really well. Same thing, you can let some ink dry and then even do some wet ink back on top of it. And as it dries, you'll get some of these kind of dark edges like this. So reference your watercolor techniques if you're looking for some interesting textures and stuff in the background. Also, you are very welcome to paint designs. So if you need to kind of fill up something with some texture, feel free to Tim Burton it up and make lots of swirlies or zigzags or stripes. So I kind of did that in here. Like I have some little swirlies on the wallpaper in the background. I also have swirls back here with the Sharpie. But the texture in the carpet here is Sharpie zigzags. I did mention earlier that if you want to After this is dry, if you want to go back and add more texture in anything with the Sharpie, you are welcome to do that. Just make sure that this is dry first. So once you're all done and you are satisfied with your project, make sure that you take a picture, submit it on Cami. And one last note, your name in class period is really important during this part, because if you need to put this on the drying rack in between days that you're working on it, we need to be able to know which bin to put it back in. So please make sure that you are labeling things properly, taking your photos, and then submitting your work.